My son stood in my kitchen with a signed will that said I was unfit to run the family farm. He told everyone I was losing my mind, and the neighbors believed him. But I found an appointment card my late husband had hidden, one that led to a lawyer Daniel never knew about. And at the meeting where he expected to take everything, the real will was read aloud. And the truth about the forgery came out. That woman is Eleanor Hartley, a 67-year-old widow who kept the family farm running for 3 years after her husband Walter died. But the day her son Daniel walked in with a document bearing Walter's signature, everything she'd built began to crumble. It was a will, one that gave Daniel the land and declared her mentally unfit. Suddenly, neighbors she'd known for decades started looking at her differently. The question that consumed her became, if Walter really signed that, why did he hide a different truth? And what would be the cost of bringing it to light? My name is Eleanor Hartley. I was born on that farm, same as my father and his father before him. 120 acres of corn and soybeans in central Illinois. Fields that stretched out like an ocean when the wind moved through them. The farmhouse was built in 1902, and every creak in its floorboards told a story I knew by heart. Walter and I were married in the front yard under the old oak tree in 1981. We raised 2 children there, fought drought and flood and falling crop prices, and we held on when half our neighbors sold out to developers. When Walter dropped dead of a heart attack 3 years ago in the North Field, I found him with the soil still under his fingernails. I promised him at the funeral that I would keep the farm. And for 3 years, I did. Every morning before dawn, I was in the barn, then the fields, then the books at night. The farm didn't just survive, it turned a small profit. But my son Daniel had other plans. Daniel was our oldest. He left for the city right out of high school, said he wanted more than dirt under his nails life. I understood. He came back only for holidays, and after Walter died, less than that. He had a charm about him, the kind that made people want to do things for him. He could walk into a room and own it within 60 seconds. When he showed up at the farm 2 months ago with a leather briefcase and a look of deep concern, I thought maybe he was finally coming home to help. Instead, he laid a document on the kitchen table. It was a will, not the one Walter and I had drawn up together with our lawyer back in 2010. This one was typed, signed at the bottom in what looked like Walter's handwriting, and dated 6 months before his death. It stated that I was no longer of sound mind and unable to manage the financial and operational responsibilities of the property. It transferred everything, the land, the equipment, the house, to Daniel, effective immediately. I read it 3 times. The words didn't make sense. Walter would never have written such a thing, but the signature was uncanny. I stared at my son. He held my gaze with sad eyes and said, "Mom, it's for your own good. You've been forgetting things. People are worried." That was the beginning of the unraveling. Daniel moved back into his old bedroom the same day. He started making phone calls to neighbors, to the grain elevator manager, to the banker who held our operating loan. He told them I was having episodes, that I'd left the stove on twice last week, that I'd forgotten to pay a seed invoice. None of that was true. But he said it with such genuine worry, such a reluctant heaviness in his voice that people believed him. These were folks I'd known for 40 years. Margie down the road, who used to babysit Daniel, stopped looking me in the eye. At church, I heard whispers. Poor Eleanor, it's so sad when the mind starts to go. The self-doubt crept in like a slow frost. I started second-guessing myself. Did I really lock the gate? Did I remember to turn off the irrigation pump? I'd lie awake at night replaying conversations, wondering if I'd missed a detail that proved Daniel was right. He was so confident. And he had a piece of paper with Walter's signature. What did I have? Just a feeling in my gut. A memory of a marriage. But memories, I was being told, were no longer reliable. The pressure to leave became unbearable. Daniel would stand in the kitchen while I made coffee and casually mention assisted living facilities he'd looked into. He brought home brochures. He told me the farm would be well cared for, he'd hire a manager, he'd modernize. He never raised his voice. He was patient, gentle. The picture of a devoted son managing a difficult situation. And every day, a little more of my resolve crumbled. Then came the morning I found myself in the barn, holding Walter's old jacket that still hung on a hook by the stall, and I whispered, "Did you really write that will?" I didn't know anymore. That's what broke me. That moment of genuine uncertainty. Daniel came in and saw me crying. He put a hand on my shoulder and said, "It's okay, Mom. We'll get through this. But you have to trust me." I agreed to start packing. Not because I believed him, but because I no longer believed myself. I gave myself 2 weeks. I pulled out cardboard boxes from the attic and began emptying the rooms that held a lifetime. I started with the kitchen, then the living room, then the bedroom Walter and I shared for 37 years. Every object was a decision. Keep, give away, throw away. I was moving through a fog. And then I reached Walter's study, the small room off the back porch where he kept the farm accounts, his ledgers, his personal papers. I had avoided it until now. His presence was strongest there. I opened the top drawer of his old oak desk and began sorting through years of receipts and notes. That's when my fingers brushed against a small leather-bound appointment book I had never seen before. I flipped it open. The pages were yellowed, filled with Walter's handwriting. It was dated from the last year of his life. Most entries were ordinary: dentist visits, a tractor service call, a lunch with an old army buddy. But near the back, tucked between 2 pages, was a business card and a note scrawled on a torn piece of paper. The card belonged to a lawyer, Henry McAllister, estate and trust law. The note said, in Walter's unmistakable hand, meeting Friday, October 4th, 3 p.m., revisions to will, witness with McAllister. October 4th was 3 weeks before the day Walter died. The will Daniel had brought was dated 6 months before. Walter had rewritten his will after that. And Daniel didn't know. I stared at that appointment book with my heart slamming against my ribs. October 4th. Walter had rewritten his will 3 weeks before he died. 3 weeks after the date on the document Daniel was using to take everything from me. My first instinct was to call Daniel, to throw this in his face. But something stopped me. The lawyer's card was tucked into a notebook Daniel had never seen, in a drawer I hadn't opened in years. Walter had hidden it. That meant he didn't trust everyone in this house. I slipped the card into my pocket, closed the study door, and went back to packing as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. That night, I lay in bed turning the card over and over in my fingers. Henry McAllister. Estate and trust law. A phone number and an address in town. I'd never heard Walter mention him. Our family attorney was old Bill Peterson, who'd handled the farm's legal work for 40 years. Why would Walter use a different lawyer just weeks before he died? The answer, I suspected, would break my heart. It would also save me. I called the number at 8 o'clock the next morning while Daniel was out at the grain elevator. An elderly woman answered. Her voice was warm, but guarded. McAllister and Associates. I asked to speak with Mr. McAllister and gave my name. There was a long pause. Then a deep, tired voice came on the line. "Mrs. Hartley, I've been waiting for this call for 3 years." The words made the room tilt. "You knew Walter?" I did. He came to me in early October, 3 weeks before his death. He was deeply troubled. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. "Tell me." McAllister cleared his throat. He made a new will. It completely supersedes any document dated prior to October 4th. It was properly witnessed by myself and my legal assistant, and it contains a very specific clause, Mrs. Hartley. It states that if any prior will should surface bearing his signature, it is to be disregarded as a forgery. The person presenting such a document is to be disinherited immediately. I couldn't breathe. He knew, I whispered. He knew someone might forge a will. He suspected it. And he wanted to protect you and the farm. The kitchen door slammed. I spun around. Daniel was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and a look I'd never seen on his face before. Something between suspicion and fear. I covered the receiver with my hand. Just a call with Aunt Margaret. She's having a hard morning. Daniel stared at me for a long moment. His eyes moved to the appointment book I'd left on the counter, the one with Walter's handwriting. I'd been careless. He walked over slowly, picked it up, and flipped it open. My heart stopped. But he only glanced at the first few pages, then set it down with a dismissive sigh. Old farm records. You should toss those. He turned to the refrigerator, poured himself a glass of juice. I scheduled the transfer appointment at the bank for Wednesday. That gives you 4 days to finish packing. Then he walked out. When I put the phone back to my ear, McAllister was still there. Mrs. Hartley? Are you all right? No, I said, but I will be. I need to see that will. I drove into town that afternoon wearing sunglasses and a scarf like a woman who didn't want to be recognized. McAllister's office was on the second floor of a brick building that had once been a feed store. The stairs creaked under my feet. He met me at the door, a tall man in his 70s with white hair and the careful posture of a former military officer. His office smelled of old books and lemon polish. He didn't waste time. He laid a thick folder on the desk between us. Your husband was a very deliberate man, Mrs. Hartley. He came to me with a draft already written in his own hand. He said he didn't want his regular lawyer involved, because anyone who knew the family might be compromised. Compromised by what? I asked. McAllister opened the folder. By Daniel. He showed me the will first. It was unmistakably Walter's language, clear, direct, no legal jargon. The farm was placed in an irrevocable trust for the benefit of me during my lifetime, and after my death, for the grandchildren, Daniel's 2 children, Abigail and Ethan. Daniel was explicitly excluded from any control over the trust assets. And then the clause McAllister had mentioned, I hereby declare that any instrument purporting to be my last will and testament bearing a date earlier than this instrument shall be disregarded. I have reason to believe such a document may be produced, and I state here for the record that any such document would be a forgery. Any person presenting it shall forfeit all rights and benefits under this, my true last will. The truth of it burned through me. Walter had known Daniel would try this. But there was more. Beneath the will was a manila envelope sealed with tape. McAllister handed it to me. He told me to give this to you personally, and only you, if you ever came looking for answers. I tore it open. Inside was a letter in Walter's handwriting, dated October 1st, 3 days before he signed the new will. My dear Eleanor, if you are reading this, my fears have come true. I've been watching Daniel closely for the past year. He's been asking about the farm, about our finances, about whether you're capable of managing things. He dropped hints that you might be slipping. I knew these were lies, but I also knew he was laying groundwork. When I looked into his situation, I found debts you wouldn't believe. He owes over $200,000 to investors from a failed business venture in Chicago. He's desperate. And desperate men do terrible things. I visited a handwriting expert last month who confirmed that my signature can be replicated with some skill. I'm afraid Daniel may try to produce a false will after I'm gone. This new will is my answer. Protect the farm. Protect the grandchildren. And if Daniel is the one to produce the forgery, show him no mercy. But if there is any hope for him, any chance he can still be saved, I leave that decision in your hands. You always saw the good in people. I saw only the facts. I trust your judgment. Yours forever, Walter. I read the letter twice, then a third time. The tears came, but I didn't let them fall. McAllister handed me a glass of water and waited in silence. Finally, I asked, the handwriting expert, "Does he have a report?" McAllister nodded. Walter commissioned a preliminary analysis of the signature that later appeared on the April will. The expert flagged 8 points of divergence. It's not definitive enough to stand alone in court, but combined with this will and your testimony, it's devastating. Daniel's document is a forgery, and Walter built the trap years before it was sprung. I sat back in the chair. The weight of it all, Walter's foresight, his protection, his willingness to believe Daniel might still be saved, pressed down on me like the heavy soil of our fields. I told McAllister about the past weeks, the neighbors believing Daniel's lies, my own self-doubt, the packing boxes filling our house. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I'll read the true will whenever you're ready. But once that happens, there's no undoing it. Daniel will be exposed. He may face criminal charges for forgery and fraud." Are you prepared for that? I wasn't prepared. Not for any of it. But I thought of Walter alone in his final weeks, setting this defense in motion while carrying a secret that must have eaten at him. I thought of Abigail and Ethan, my grandchildren, who deserved a legacy that wasn't stolen. And I thought of Daniel, who had looked me in the eye and told me I was losing my mind. "I'm ready," I said, "but I want to do it at the farm. I want Daniel to hear it in the house his father built." We set the meeting for 4 days later. McAllister would arrive with the will and the supporting documents. I would invite Daniel, his wife Karen, and anyone else he wanted present. It would look like a surrender, like I was finally giving up the farm. But I knew it would be anything but. The next days were an exercise in deception. I finished packing boxes I would now never move. I let Daniel believe I was broken. He grew more confident, even kind. He started talking about renovations and modernizing the operation. He mentioned that Karen's brother was interested in managing the fields. I nodded along and kept my face empty. At night, I would sit in the barn with Walter's jacket and tell him about my day. I'd tell him I was close. I'd tell him I was going to keep my promise. On the morning of the meeting, I woke before dawn. The house was silent. I made coffee, walked the property line as the sun came up, and said a prayer for my son. Because I knew that a few hours from now, his world would collapse. And despite everything, I still loved him. I arranged the living room with a long table, chairs from the kitchen, and a fresh pot of coffee. Daniel came down at 8, looking pleased with himself. "Today's the day, Mom. No more stress." Karen arrived shortly after in a new SUV I hadn't seen before, wearing a dress that cost more than a month's harvest. They sat together on the sofa, holding hands. Daniel's phone buzzed, and he glanced at a message. He smiled. Probably a neighbor wishing him luck. They all thought this was the final transfer of power. At precisely 9 o'clock, a knock came at the door. I opened it to find Henry McAllister in a pressed gray suit, carrying his leather briefcase. Behind him stood a woman I didn't recognize, late 50s, with a notary's seal pinned to her lapel. Daniel looked up, confused. "Who's this?" "Our lawyer," I said. "I thought we should have everything done properly." Daniel's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. Of course, always good to have legal formality. He stood and shook McAllister's hand, still confident, still playing the charming son. We all sat around the table. McAllister opened his briefcase and withdrew the folder. Daniel leaned forward. I saw his eyes move to the document, expecting it to be a deed transfer or some acknowledgement of his April will. What he saw instead was a thick document with a seal and 2 witness signatures. McAllister cleared his throat. "Mr. Hartley, Mrs. Hartley. This is a reading of the last will and testament of Walter James Hartley, dated October 4th, 2021. This document is the only legally valid will. Daniel's face went white. That was the moment. The room held its breath. And I realized that everything Walter had planned was now in motion, and nothing would ever be the same. McAllister began reading aloud. His voice was steady, formal, utterly unstoppable. I, Walter James Hartley, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all prior wills and codicils. I give my entire estate, real and personal, to my wife Eleanor Marie Hartley in trust for her lifetime, with remainder to my grandchildren Abigail Hartley and Ethan Hartley in equal shares upon her death. Daniel's hand tightened on the table edge. His knuckles went white. Karen leaned in, her face frozen. McAllister continued, I specifically exclude my son Daniel William Hartley from any inheritance, appointment as executor, or authority over the trust assets. I further declare that any document purporting to be my last will and testament and bearing a date earlier than October 4th, 2021, is a forgery. Any person presenting such a document shall forfeit any right they might otherwise have under this will. Daniel was on his feet. The chair scraped back across the floor hard enough to leave a mark. This is absurd. That's not my father's signature. That whole document is a fake. McAllister didn't flinch. He reached into his folder and withdrew a second document. A letter-sized envelope with a forensic lab seal. Mr. Hartley, your father anticipated this response. He retained the services of a certified forensic document examiner. This analysis compares the signature on the April will you presented with 16 verified exemplars of your father's handwriting. He slid the report across the table. 8 points of divergence, pressure differentials inconsistent with his known writing pattern, stroke hesitation markers that indicate tracing, not natural execution. And the ink on that document is not the type your father used for any known legal instrument. Daniel snatched the report, eyes scanning. His breathing went ragged. No, this is wrong. Dad was losing it. He was paranoid. That new will was made under duress. She manipulated him. He pointed at me. She's been slipping for years. Ask anyone. Ask the neighbors. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. McAllister removed a third item from the folder, a sealed statement from Walter's primary physician, dated 2 weeks before his death. He read it aloud. I have examined Mr. Hartley on multiple occasions in the final months of his life. He exhibited no cognitive decline, no confusion, and no impairment of judgment. He was a man of sound mind. Daniel's face contorted. He looked at Karen, but Karen was staring at me. Her expression had shifted from confident to cautious, like a person realizing she might be standing on the wrong side of a line she hadn't seen. Then, McAllister delivered the blow that made the room go cold. There is one more document, Mrs. Hartley. Your husband asked me to present it only after the will was read, and only in the presence of your son. He withdrew a manila folder with a red tab. This is a letter of intent signed by your son and a land development corporation based in Chicago. It's dated 5 months before your husband's death. I felt the world tilt sideways. What are you saying? McAllister met my eyes. Walter discovered that Daniel had been negotiating the sale of the farm before his death. The letter of intent proposes the transfer of all 120 acres to Windcrest Development for $3.2 million, contingent on Daniel gaining full control of the property. The land would be rezoned for commercial use. The farmhouse, the barn, the fields, all of it would be demolished. Daniel screamed. That's a lie. That's a damn lie. But his voice cracked, and his hands were shaking. I stood up slowly, my legs barely holding me. You are going to sell the farm? This farm? Daniel's eyes darted around the room, looking for an exit that wasn't there. Karen grabbed his arm. Daniel, is that true? You told me we were just going to run the place, that your mother couldn't handle it. You never said anything about selling. He yanked his arm away. Stay out of this, Karen. You don't understand. She backed up a step, her face a mask of betrayal. McAllister placed the letter of intent on the table. I saw Walter's handwriting in the margins, notes he'd made after obtaining the document. Windcrest CEO met with D. 3 times. 3rd meeting recorded. D. Offered immediate possession if I declined. He didn't know I was listening. My husband had worn a wire. He'd sat in pain, carrying the weight of a terminal heart condition, and documented his own son's conspiracy to sell the land our family had worked for 4 generations. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. Daniel sank back into his chair. The fight drained out of him, replaced by something hollow and hunted. Karen was already gathering her purse, not looking at anyone. I saw her face. She had believed a version of the story, and now that version was ash. The neighbors he'd manipulated, the lies about my mind, none of it mattered now. The truth was laid out on that table like evidence at a trial, because it was evidence. And it was enough to send my son to prison for a very long time. I looked at Daniel. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I saw him as he'd been at 7 years old, kneeling in the garden with me, planting tomato seeds with dirty hands and a serious face. I saw him at 18, proud in his graduation gown, promising he'd always come home. Then, I saw the man who had stood in my kitchen and told me I was unfit, who had forged his father's name, who had tried to erase our history for $3 million. McAllister closed the folder and addressed me quietly. Mrs. Hartley, this evidence is sufficient to refer for criminal prosecution. The decision of how to proceed is yours and yours alone. The room waited. Karen stood frozen near the doorway. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps, and I held in my hands the power to destroy my son completely, or to do something my husband had asked of me in his final letter, to see if there was any hope left in the man I had raised. The next words I spoke would change everything. I turned to Daniel and said, I have a question for you, and your answer will determine what happens next. I looked at my son across that table and asked him the question that had been burning in my chest since the moment I found Walter's appointment book. Why? Why did you do it, Daniel? Not the money, not the land. I need to hear you say what broke inside you to make you turn on your own family. He didn't answer right away. His jaw worked. His eyes flicked to Karen, to McAllister, to the damning papers spread between us. Then they settled on Walter's old chair in the corner, the one still shaped by years of his father's weight. And something in him crumbled. Because I was drowning, he whispered. I lost everything in Chicago. The business, the money, the friends. I owed $260,000 to people who don't send collection letters, they send lawyers, Mom. I was going to lose the house, the cars, Karen's entire life. And I couldn't come home as a failure. I couldn't stand the thought of you looking at me with disappointment. His voice broke. So I made a plan. I'd take the farm, sell it, pay the debts, and buy you a nice little place somewhere. I told myself you'd be better off, that you were too old to manage it. I convinced myself it was true. The confession hung in the air, raw and ugly. Karen's hand had fallen away from his arm. Her face was stone. You lied to me about everything. She said it flat, without a question mark. Daniel didn't deny it. She walked to the door, paused, and looked back at me. Not at him. I'm sorry, Eleanor, I didn't know. Then she left. The front door closed softly, and her SUV started up and drove away. McAllister cleared his throat. Mrs. Hartley, with what's on this table, the state's attorney would have no trouble bringing charges. Forgery, fraud, attempted theft of an estate. We could end this here legally and permanently. He was right. I could call the sheriff right now and Daniel would leave in handcuffs. The neighbors would see it. The town would talk. Justice would be served cold and complete. But that wasn't what Walter had asked of me. In his letter, he'd said, if there is any hope for him, any chance he can still be saved, I leave that decision in your hands. I reached into my pocket and pulled out Walter's letter, the one I'd read a dozen times. I slid it across the table to Daniel. Read it, out loud. I want you to hear your father's words. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the page. He started reading. My dear Eleanor, his voice broke on the second sentence, but he kept going through the debts, the investigation, the handwriting expert, the trap Walter had built. And then the final line, if there is any hope for him, any chance he can still be saved, I leave that decision in your hands. You always saw the good in people. I saw only the facts. By the time he finished, Daniel was sobbing. Not quiet tears, deep, wrenching sobs that shook his whole body. He buried his face in his hands. He knew. He knew everything, and he still hoped I could be saved. I let him cry. McAllister looked away out of respect. The silence stretched. Then I spoke. Daniel, I'm not going to call the sheriff. I'm not going to have you arrested. Not because you deserve mercy. You don't. But because your father asked me to consider it, and because I raised you, and because somewhere inside you is still the boy who planted tomatoes with me and promised he'd always come home. He looked up, face swollen, disbelieving. But there are conditions. I told him what his life would look like from this moment forward. The farm, by law, is now in an irrevocable trust for Abigail and Ethan. It cannot be sold, leveraged, or divided. I remain in the house for the rest of my life, managing the land with full authority. If Daniel wants to stay, if he truly wants to earn back even a fraction of what he threw away, he will work here. Not as owner, not as manager, not as heir. He will work as a hired hand. He will report to me every morning, take direction, get his hands dirty in the same fields his father and grandfather worked. He will earn a wage, nothing more. No equity, no control, no shortcuts. If he completes 5 years of honest labor without a single lie, without a single scheme, then at the end of that time I will consider, only consider, whether to petition the trust to grant him a minor role in its oversight. But the land will never be his. That ship sailed when he forged his father's name. This is your one honest chance, I said, not a second inheritance. A first chance to become the man your father hoped you could be. Take it, or walk away. But know that if you walk, this file goes to the prosecutor tomorrow. Daniel stared at the table for a long time. I could see the war inside him, pride versus survival, old entitlement versus new reality. Finally, he nodded. I'll do it. I'll work. His voice was small, but it wasn't bargaining. It was surrender. McAllister closed his briefcase. I'll record this resolution in writing and have both parties sign an agreement that preserves the estate's protections while documenting your son's voluntary commitment to employment on the farm. It's not a contract of inheritance. It's a contract of behavior. He looked at Daniel. You understand you can be terminated from this employment at any time, and that termination triggers full legal exposure. Daniel nodded again. I understand. 3 days later, the document was signed in the same living room, with the notary as witness. Daniel moved his belongings into the old bunkhouse, the small cabin beyond the barn that hadn't been used since the grandchildren's last summer visit. He didn't argue. For the first time in years, he didn't charm or negotiate. He just took the cot, the dresser, and the wood stove. The change in the community was slower and messier. Word spread about the true will. Margie from down the road showed up at my door with an apple pie and tears in her eyes. "I should have known," she said. "I should have trusted you." I didn't say it's okay, because it wasn't. But I accepted the pie. One by one, the neighbors came back. Some with baked goods, some with awkward apologies, some just with silence that wasn't judgmental anymore. The fog of suspicion lifted, but the memory of how easily they'd believed the worst lingered like a scar. Karen filed for divorce within 2 weeks. McAllister helped her navigate the tangled legal reality. Since the marriage had been built on financial fraud, the court moved quickly. She left town for good, and Daniel didn't fight it. I think part of him was relieved that the charade was over. As for the farm, spring planting came and went with Daniel walking the fields behind me, learning rhythms he'd rejected at 18. The first few weeks were brutal. He'd softened in the city, and the physical work left him exhausted and blistered. Some evenings he'd sit at the table silent, too tired to speak. I didn't coddle him, but I made sure there was always coffee and a hot meal. Healing isn't linear, and forgiveness isn't made of words. Then came the surprising discovery I hadn't expected. It happened 6 months after the meeting, in the middle of harvest. We were moving the old combine through the back 40 when a hydraulic line burst, spraying fluid across the engine block. Daniel was with me. He didn't panic. He didn't reach for his phone. He walked to the toolbox, pulled on gloves, and started the repair. I watched his hands move with a competence I hadn't seen before. A muscle memory from boyhood that had survived the years of city living. He worked in silence, methodical and patient, and for a few moments I saw Walter in his movements. Not Walter the betrayed father, but Walter the teacher. The man who'd spent 20 years bending over an engine block and singing along to classic rock. When Daniel finished, he wiped his forehead and said, "Dad taught me this when I was 12. I'd forgotten how much I loved it. That was the real turning point. Not the legal agreement, not the promise he'd made in front of McAllister, but that quiet recognition that his father had given him something more valuable than land. A skill, a connection, a way to be useful. And he'd thrown it away for $3 million. He'd be glad to see you remembering, I said. Daniel's throat moved. I wish I'd told him it mattered. I wish I'd said it before he died. I put my hand on his shoulder. He knows. Somewhere, he knows. That evening, I pulled out the small wooden box from Walter's safe deposit box, the one he'd told McAllister to give me. Inside was a cassette tape. I'd listened to it twice since the meeting. It was the recording Walter had made of Daniel's third meeting with the Windcrest developers. His voice, cold and transactional, outlining the demolition plan. I'd listened to it alone, carrying the weight of it. Now I played it for Daniel. He sat in Walter's chair, head bowed, and heard himself bargain away his family's legacy. When it finished, he said nothing for a long time. Then, burn it. I don't want it to exist. I didn't burn it. I locked it away. Not as a weapon, but as a reminder that the truth has no expiration date. The years since then have rebuilt what the fraud nearly destroyed. The farm is thriving, not because of me, but because the trust forced us to plan for the grandchildren's future, not just the next harvest. Abigail is 17 now, and she spends summers here learning the soil. Ethan is 14, more interested in basketball than tractors, but he comes too. Daniel works alongside them as Uncle Daniel, not the owner, not the boss. And the trust's provisions say that if he is still in good standing when Abigail turns 21, she and Ethan may choose to grant him a non-controlling interest. A vote of confidence from the next generation. That's the one honest chance I offered him, and he's still earning it every day. Looking back, I realize Walter's plan wasn't about punishment. It was about protection with an open door. He knew Daniel might never change, but he built a structure that allowed redemption if redemption was possible. He trusted me to know the difference. I almost didn't. For those weeks when I doubted my own mind, when I packed boxes in a fog of confusion, I came closer to losing everything than anyone in this town will ever know. But Walter's love reached past his death and put a document in my hands that said, "She is not crazy. She is not unfit. She is the rightful steward of this land." And because of that, the farm isn't a shopping center. The old oak tree still stands. And my son is finding his way back, one honest day at a time. I think about Walter often, not with the raw grief of those first months after he died, but with something closer to wonder. He carried a secret investigation, a new will, and the knowledge that his own son might betray him, and he never let the weight of it break his spirit. He just kept working in that garage, kept singing along to his old songs, kept loving me in the quiet ways he always had, and he trusted me to finish what he started. That's the part that still gets me, the trust. Even in death, he believed I'd find the strength I didn't know I had. I suppose that's the question this whole story leaves behind. We think of legacy as land, money, things you can touch. But Walter's real legacy wasn't the farm or the car or even the stock certificates he'd hidden away. It was the structure he built to protect the people he loved and the door he left open for redemption. He knew Daniel might never walk through it. He gave me the power to decide. And watching Daniel now, dirty hands, honest sweat, learning to earn something he once tried to steal, I see the wisdom in that. Not everyone who's been wronged gets that choice. And not everyone who gets it would offer it. I almost didn't. The day I stood in the garage and realized my son had sold his father's car, I felt nothing but rage. The day I found the appointment book, I felt nothing but vindication. But rage and vindication are fire, they burn, and then they burn out. What remains after is the human being standing in the ashes. You have to decide what to do with him. I chose to offer one honest chance. I don't know if it will fully heal him. Some betrayals leave marks that never fade. But I know this. The farm is safe. My grandchildren will inherit a legacy their father couldn't sell. And a man who once plotted to destroy his family now gets up at dawn to tend the fields his family has worked for 100 years. That's a story still being written. So I'll ask you what I've asked myself 1,000 times in the quiet of that farmhouse kitchen. Could you forgive someone who tried to take everything from you? Not cheap forgiveness, the kind that lets someone off the hook without consequence, but the hard kind. The kind that demands truth, accountability, and years of proof before trust is earned back. Could you offer that chance to a child who broke your heart? I hope you never have to find out. But if you do, maybe my story will be a small light in a dark place. A reminder that strength isn't just about fighting back. It's sometimes about holding a door open when every instinct tells you to slam it shut. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story meant something to you, please leave a comment and let me know your thoughts. And if you want to hear more stories of ordinary people who found extraordinary strength, subscribe to this channel. We're telling the stories that remind us all that our best chapters can happen at any age.